The grand hall of Silver Oak Enterprises buzzed with the chatter of sharply dressed executives. The long glass conference table gleamed under the warm glow of the chandelier, and the air smelled of expensive cologne and freshly brewed coffee. It was an ordinary business meeting for most of the people in that room, except for one person. In the farthest chair, sitting stiffly and unsure, was a man who clearly didn't belong. His faded uniform, rough hands, and nervous glances made him stand out in the sea of tailored suits. His name was Rafiq, a janitor who had worked in this building for years, mopping floors and emptying trash cans. He had never once imagined that he would be invited to sit among the company's highest executives. Yet here he was, and the person responsible for this shocking invitation. The company's owner, Meher Rizvi, a rich, elegant widow known for her sharp business acumen and an even sharper sense of secrecy. People in the industry whispered about her. How she had transformed her late husband's struggling business into an empire, how she never revealed her true intentions until the last moment. And now, she had done something no one could have expected. The board members exchanged puzzled looks, whispering among themselves. Why was a janitor here? What could he possibly have to do with the future of their company? Was this some kind of test? A joke? A publicity stunt? But Meher sat calmly at the head of the table, her expression unreadable, her gaze fixed on Rafiq as if he was the most important person in the room. Rafiq himself had no idea why he was here. He had received the formal invitation just the night before, delivered in an elegant envelope with the company's seal. At first, he thought it was a mistake, maybe a joke played by one of the younger employees. But when he saw Meher's personal signature at the bottom of the letter, his heart started pounding. He barely slept that night, replaying every possible reason she could have for calling him. And now, as he sat in the middle of powerful people, their eyes drilling into him with judgment and curiosity, he felt his palms grow damp. He didn't belong here. He was just a janitor. He had nothing valuable to offer. Then Meher leaned forward slightly, her eyes locked onto his. "Mr. Rafiq," she said in a voice that was both calm and commanding. "Do you know why I invited you here?" Silence gripped the room. Rafiq swallowed hard. He didn't have an answer. And then Meher did something that left everyone speechless. She smiled. A knowing, almost mysterious smile. What happened next would change everything. Rafiq's throat felt dry. His mind raced for an answer, but nothing made sense. Why would Meher Rizvi, one of the most powerful businesswomen in the city, call him, a janitor, to this grand meeting? He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, aware of the way the executives stared at him, their faces filled with doubt, some even with quiet amusement. "I don't know," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. Meher's eyes didn't waver. "Are you sure?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. Rafiq clenched his hands together on the table, feeling the weight of everyone's attention pressing down on him. His thoughts scrambled through every possible interaction he had ever had with her. He had worked in this building for years, keeping his head down, doing his job without much thought. He had seen her in passing a few times, usually from a distance, always surrounded by important-looking people. She had never spoken to him directly before. Not once. "I just clean the floors," he said finally, his voice steady but uncertain. "I don't know anything about business." A low chuckle came from one of the executives, but Meher's sharp glance silenced it immediately. She leaned forward, her fingers tapping lightly on the table. "Sometimes those who watch from the sidelines see more than those in the game," she said, her voice smooth and measured. "Tell me, Rafiq, do you ever notice things while you work?" Rafiq blinked. Notice things. He wasn't sure what she meant. He noticed a lot of things. Papers left behind in meeting rooms, coffee stains on expensive carpets, whispered conversations when people thought no one was listening. But those things weren't important, were they? "I guess I do," he admitted cautiously. Meher smiled again, as if that was the answer she had expected. "That's good," she said. Then, turning slightly, she gestured towards the executives. Gentlemen, let me tell you something about Rafiq here. He is the kind of person most of you ignore. You walk past him every day without thinking twice. But do you know what that means? The room was silent. No one spoke. It means, she continued, that he sees and hears everything you don't. A few murmurs rippled through the table. Some of the executives exchanged wary glances. Others shifted in their seats, as if suddenly uncomfortable. Rafiq felt his stomach tighten. He wasn't sure where this was going, but he didn't like the direction it was taking. He had spent years blending into the background, making sure no one noticed him. Now all of a sudden he was being put in the spotlight and it made his skin crawl. I don't understand, he said hesitantly. Why does that matter? Meher leaned back in her chair, folding her hands together. Because I believe you know something, she said, her voice calm but firm. Something that could change everything. Rafiq's heart pounded. What was she talking about? What could he possibly know? He was just a janitor. He had no power, no influence. He simply did his job and went home. One of the executives, a man with a sharp jawline and expensive cufflinks, cleared his throat. Mrs. Rizvi, with all due respect, are we really here to listen to a janitor's observations, he said, his tone laced with disbelief. We have important matters to discuss. Meher turned her gaze toward him, and though her expression remained composed, there was an unmistakable edge to her voice when she spoke. Mr. Hamid, do you think knowledge only comes from those with expensive suits and high-ranking titles? The man hesitated, then forced a tight-lipped smile. Of course not, ma'am. I just mean. I know what you mean, Meher cut in smoothly. But let me remind you, the most powerful insights often come from unexpected places. She turned back to Rafiq, her expression softening. Rafiq, I need you to think carefully, she said. Over the past few months, have you seen or heard anything unusual in this building? Anything that didn't sit right with you? Rafiq swallowed. 100 different memories flashed through his mind. Late-night meetings behind closed doors, whispers in hallways, documents left carelessly on desks. He had never paid them much attention before, thinking they weren't his business. But now, as he sat in this room, he started to wonder. There was one thing. A conversation he had overheard a few weeks ago while cleaning the executive floor late at night. He hadn't thought much of it then, but now it stood out. He hesitated. If he said something, he could get into trouble. He wasn't supposed to be listening to private conversations. But if he didn't speak up, would he be making a mistake? Meher seemed to sense his hesitation. She leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice. You have nothing to fear, she assured him. Just tell me what you remember. Rafiq took a deep breath. His hands clenched together under the table. Then, after a long pause, he spoke. I was cleaning the hallway outside one of the conference rooms, he said slowly. It was late, almost midnight. I heard voices inside. 2 men. They were arguing. The room went still. Meher's eyes remained locked on him. What were they arguing about? Rafiq hesitated again, but this time, he knew there was no turning back. He met her gaze and said money. And something about missing reports. A few executives visibly stiffened. Some exchanged nervous glances. Others stared straight ahead, their faces unreadable. Meher's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Something sharp, calculating. And did you recognize the voices? She asked. Rafiq nodded slowly. One of them was Mr. Hamid. Silence. All eyes turned to the man in question. Hamid's face darkened, but he forced a chuckle. This is absurd, he scoffed, shaking his head. You're seriously going to believe the words of a janitor? Meher didn't react. She simply studied him, her expression unreadable. Do you deny it? She asked. Hamid's jaw tightened. I have late meetings all the time. That doesn't mean anything. Perhaps, Meher said. Then, turning back to Rafiq, she asked, and the other voice? Did you recognize it? Rafiq hesitated again, but he shook his head. Oh. I don't know who it was. Meher tapped her fingers against the table, deep in thought. Then after a long pause she spoke. Thank you, Rafiq, she said. That will be all for now. Rafiq wasn't sure whether he felt relieved or more anxious. He could feel the weight of everyone's stares on him as he slowly rose from his seat. His heart hammered against his chest. Had he just made a mistake? As he turned to leave, Meher's voice stopped him. Oh, and one more thing, she said. Stay close. I might need your help again. Rafiq's stomach twisted. He nodded, then quickly exited the room. Behind him, the tension in the air remained thick. Something big was about to unfold, and he was now right in the middle of it. Rafiq stepped out of the conference room, his heart pounding so loudly it echoed in his ears. The hallway outside felt unnaturally quiet, as if the entire building was holding its breath. He wasn't sure what had just happened in there, but one thing was clear. He had said something that had shifted the air in that room. And now, he was part of something much bigger than he understood. He walked back toward the janitor's closet, his hands still shaking. His shift wasn't over yet, but there was no way he could focus on cleaning floors after what had just happened. His mind kept replaying Meher's words. Stay close. I might need your help again. What did that mean? Why him? And why had she looked at Hamid the way she did? As if she already knew he was hiding something. Before he could process his thoughts, a voice called out behind him. Rafiq. He turned sharply, his chest tightening. It was Bilal, another janitor who had been working in the building for a few months. He was younger, always quiet, always keeping to himself. But now his face was tense, his eyes darting down the hallway before he stepped closer. What happened in there? Bilal whispered. Rafiq frowned. You heard. Bilal nodded. Everyone's talking about it. A janitor sitting in a board meeting. That's never happened before. Rafiq exhaled, rubbing his temples. I don't know, man. I don't know what's going on. Bilal hesitated. Then, lowering his voice even more, he said, Be careful. Rafiq's eyes snapped to his. What do you mean? Bilal looked around again, making sure no one was nearby. Then he whispered, This place isn't as clean as it looks. Rafiq's stomach tightened. What are you saying? Bilal hesitated for a moment, then shook his head. Just watch your back. And with that he walked away, leaving Rafiq standing there, his mind spinning. What did he mean? Was this about what he had overheard that night? He had tried to push the memory away before, but now, standing there, it started coming back to him in clearer pieces. That argument. Hamid had been frustrated, his voice tense. But the other man, the one Rafiq didn't recognize, had sounded calm, almost cold. We can't afford any loose ends, the unknown voice had said. Hamid had responded sharply. And what do you suggest? Getting rid of it. Long pause. Then in a low voice the man had said, Just make sure it disappears. No traces. At the time, Rafiq had told himself they were talking about company reports or some financial issue. But now, with Meher's questions and Bilal's strange warning, something about it didn't sit right. Was it really just about missing documents? Or was it something much bigger? That night, Rafiq barely slept. His tiny apartment, usually his place of peace after long shifts, felt unsettlingly quiet. He kept thinking about the look in Meher's eyes when he had mentioned the argument. She hadn't been surprised. It was almost like she had been waiting for him to say it. The next morning when he arrived at work, something felt off. The air was heavier. People were whispering more than usual. He could feel the tension in the hallways. As he made his way to the janitor's closet, he noticed Hamid walking briskly down the corridor. His face was tight, his jaw clenched. But the moment he spotted Rafiq, his eyes darkened. For the first time in all his years working in this building, Rafiq felt truly nervous. Hamid stopped right in front of him. A word. Rafiq hesitated. Sir. Hamid's smile was tight, forced. Let's not make this bigger than it is, he said quietly. You had your little moment in there yesterday. But I suggest you don't involve yourself in things that don't concern you. Rafiq's throat tightened. I didn't mean to. You didn't mean to what? Hamid interrupted, his voice dangerously low. You're a janitor. You don't belong in those meetings. You don't understand how these things work. Rafiq swallowed hard, but he forced himself to hold Hamid's gaze. I just answered what I was asked. Hamid's eyes flickered with something unreadable. Then he leaned in slightly and whispered, Then let's hope you don't get asked anything else. And with that he walked away, leaving Rafiq standing there, his stomach twisting with unease. This was more than just an argument about reports. Something was very, very wrong. By the afternoon, the entire office was in a strange state of unrest. Meher had cancelled all her scheduled meetings for the day. Executives were having hushed conversations in the corners. Something was happening behind closed doors. And then, as Rafiq was heading toward the service elevator, he felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned around and found himself staring at Meher's personal assistant, a woman named Nadia. She was always professional, always composed, but today there was urgency in her eyes. Mrs. Rizvi wants to see you, she said quietly. Rafiq's pulse spiked. Now. Nadia nodded. Come with me. As they walked toward Meher's private office, Rafiq could feel the stares following him. He could hear the whispers growing louder. Why was he being called in again? What did Meher know? And more importantly, what was he about to find out? When they reached the office, Nadia opened the heavy wooden door and gestured for him to step inside. Meher was sitting at her large desk, her hands folded neatly in front of her. She looked calm, but her sharp eyes held something unreadable. She gestured toward the chair across from her. Sit. Rafiq hesitated, then obeyed. His hands felt clammy. His heart wouldn't slow down. For a long moment, Meher simply studied him. Then, in a quiet voice, she asked, Do you trust me, Rafiq? The question caught him off guard. His fingers tightened on the edge of his seat. He paused. I don't understand. Meher's lips pressed together slightly. I need to know if I can trust you. Because if you stay involved in this, there is no turning back. Rafiq's stomach dropped. Involved in what? Meher exhaled slowly, then leaned forward. I believe this company is being stolen from, she said. And I believe Hamid is at the center of it. Rafiq's breath hitched. I've been gathering evidence, she continued. But I needed someone who could see things others don't. Someone no one pays attention to. Realization dawned on Rafiq. That's why you called me into the meeting. Meher nodded. You might be the key to proving what's happening. Rafiq's pulse pounded in his ears. He had come to work every day just to do his job. He had never wanted to be part of something like this. But now he was in it. And he had a feeling there was no way out. Rafiq's breath felt shallow. The walls of Meher's office seemed to close in on him as her words echoed in his head. You might be the key to proving what's happening. He had spent his life being invisible, blending into the background, unnoticed and unheard. But now he was at the center of something dangerous, something bigger than he had ever imagined. His hands gripped the edge of the chair. I don't understand, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Why me? Why not someone else? Meher studied him for a long moment before speaking. Because no one notices you, Rafiq. You move through these halls, and people don't think twice about your presence. That makes you powerful in a way they don't realize. She leaned forward slightly. And because I know you've already seen things. You just don't know what they mean yet. Rafiq's mind raced. The argument he had overheard, the whispers, the way Hamid had threatened him earlier. It was all connected. He had tried to push it aside, convince himself it was none of his business, but now there was no denying it. Something corrupt was happening in this company. And Meher wanted his help to expose it. What do you want me to do? He asked hesitantly. Meher's expression didn't change. I need proof, she said simply. And you're in the perfect position to get it. Rafiq's stomach twisted. This wasn't a simple request. If he agreed, he would be stepping into something dangerous. But if he refused, what then? Would Hamid come after him anyway? Would he always wonder if he had walked away from something that could have changed his life? Before he could answer, Meher's intercom buzzed. Nadia's voice came through, urgent and tense. Mrs. Rizvi, Hamid is asking to see you. Right now. Meher's eyes darkened slightly. Tell him I'm busy. There was a pause. Then Nadia's voice returned, quieter. Mem, I think he knows something. He's not alone. Rafiq's pulse spiked. He looked at Meher, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of concern in her otherwise calm eyes. She exhaled slowly, then stood. It seems we don't have much time. He turned to Rafiq. If you want to walk away, do it now. But if you stay, understand that you're no longer just a janitor. You're in this with me. Rafiq's heart pounded. He had spent years being ignored, believing that he had no voice, no power. But maybe, for the first time in his life, he had the chance to matter. To do something that made a difference. He swallowed hard and nodded. I'm in. Meher gave a small, approving nod. Then we need to move fast. She walked over to her desk and opened a drawer, pulling out a sleek USB drive. There's a server room on the executive floor, she said. It holds the company's internal records. If Hamid has been stealing, that's where we'll find the evidence. She placed the USB drive in Rafiq's hand. Plug this in. It'll copy whatever files are related to the missing reports. Rafiq stared at the tiny device in his palm. What if someone sees me? Meher's lips pressed together. That's why you have an advantage. No one will think twice about a janitor walking into that room. Rafiq's chest tightened, but he nodded. He had spent years walking through this building unnoticed. Now, that very invisibility was the only thing keeping him safe. A knock on the door made them both freeze. Nadia stepped inside quickly, closing the door behind her. He's getting impatient, she said in a hushed voice. And he's not alone. There are 2 men with him. Meher's jaw tightened. Security. Nadia nodded. Not our usual guys. They look different. A chill ran down Rafiq's spine. He wasn't sure what that meant, but he didn't like the sound of it. Meher turned to him. Go now, she whispered. Don't stop for anything. Once you have the files, bring them straight to me. Rafiq shoved the USB into his pocket and nodded quickly. His legs felt unsteady as he made his way to the door. Nadia cracked it open just slightly, peeking out before whispering, The hallway's clear. Go. Rafiq slipped out, his heart racing. He moved quickly but carefully, keeping his head down like he always did. No one questioned a janitor walking through the building. They never had before, and he was counting on that now. As he approached the executive floor, his palms started to sweat. The server room was at the end of the hall, past a set of glass offices where high-ranking executives worked. If anyone looked up, they would see him. He took a deep breath, pushing the cart of cleaning supplies he had grabbed on the way up. His movements were slow, casual, like he was just going about his usual work. When he reached the door, he hesitated for only a second before swiping his janitor's access card. The lock beeped, and the door clicked open. He stepped inside quickly, shutting it behind him. The hum of computers filled the room, the glow of screens casting strange shadows on the walls. He moved to the nearest terminal and pulled out the USB. His hands trembled slightly as he plugged it in. The screen flickered as the device started copying files. Progress bar appeared. 15%, 30%. Every second felt like an eternity. His ears strained for any sound outside the door. 50%, 70%. His heart pounded. Almost there. And then, noise. Footstep just outside the door. Rafiq's breath caught. He froze, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. The handle of the door shifted. Someone was outside. He had only seconds to decide what to do. The door handle turned slightly, then stopped. Rafiq held his breath, his entire body frozen. The progress bar on the screen showed 85%, 90%. He clenched his fists, praying that whoever was outside would move on. Long pause. Then footsteps, moving away. Rafiq exhaled shakily, his heart still hammering in his chest. He turned back to the screen. 95%, 98%, and then finally 100%. The file transfer was complete. He yanked the USB drive out and stuffed it into his pocket just as another sound made him tense up. The door handle turned again. This time it didn't stop. The door swung open. Hamid stood in the doorway. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Rafiq felt every nerve in his body scream at him to run, but his legs refused to move. Hamid's eyes flickered to the computer screen, then back to Rafiq. His face darkened. "What?" he said quietly, stepping inside and shutting the door behind him. "Do you think you're doing?" Rafiq's mind raced. He couldn't tell the truth. But what lie would be believable? I was just cleaning," he stammered, gripping the mop in his cart as if it could somehow shield him. Hamid's gaze was sharp, assessing. Then his eyes landed on the USB slot. His lips curled slightly. "Cleaning," he repeated. His voice was too calm, too knowing. Rafiq's pulse spiked. He knew. Before he could react, Hamid stepped closer, his voice low. "Do you have any idea what you've just involved yourself in?" Rafiq swallowed hard. "I don't know what you're talking about." Hamid smirked, shaking his head. "Don't play dumb. Meher sent you, didn't she?" Rafiq's heart nearly stopped. How did he know? Hamid let out a short laugh, but there was no humor in it. "She thinks she's so clever." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "But she doesn't realize she's already lost." Something in his tone made Rafiq's stomach turn. "She's not the one stealing from this company," Hamid continued. "She's the one being framed." Rafiq's breath caught. His mind reeled. "What?" Hamid's smirk widened. "You think you're helping her? You think she's the victim?" He scoffed. "Meher has been walking into a trap this whole time. And now, thanks to you, she has no way out." Rafiq felt a cold sweat on his back. He shook his head. "You're lying." Hamid took another step forward. "Am I?" He tilted his head. "Then tell me, why do you think she brought you into this?" Rafiq's fingers clenched into fists. "Because she needed someone who wouldn't question her," Hamid continued. "Someone desperate enough to do whatever she asked. Someone who would take the fall when everything crumbles." The words hit like a punch to the stomach. Rafiq wanted to deny it. Wanted to believe Meher had been honest with him. But now, doubt started creeping in. Was he just a pawn? Hamid took advantage of his hesitation. "You think she's some grieving widow fighting for justice?" He chuckled darkly. "She's not. She's just as dirty as the rest of them." Rafiq shook his head. "Then why are you trying to stop her?" Hamid's smirk faded slightly. "Because she's getting in the way of something much bigger than her. Something she has no business interfering with." Rafiq's mind was spinning. He had walked into this thinking Hamid was the villain. That Meher was trying to expose the truth. But what if Hamid was right? What if the truth was more complicated than he had been led to believe? Hamid leaned in slightly. "Give me the USB." Rafiq tensed. "I know you took the files," Hamid said. "But they don't prove what you think they do. All they'll do is destroy the wrong person." Rafiq's breath was shaky. "And you want to protect yourself?" Hamid gave him a knowing look. "I want to keep things from getting worse." The weight of the USB in Rafiq's pocket suddenly felt unbearable. Who was telling the truth? If he gave it to Meher, was he helping expose corruption? Or was he handing her the very thing that could take her down? He had no idea. But before he could decide, something happened that neither of them expected. A voice from the hallway. "Where is he?" It wasn't Meher. It wasn't Nadia. It was one of the men who had come with Hamid. Hamid's jaw tightened. He turned to the door. Rafiq saw his chance. Without thinking, he grabbed the mop bucket and shoved it forward, knocking Hamid off balance. Then, before he could stop himself, he bolted out the door. Shouts echoed behind him. "Get him!" His legs burned as he ran down the hallway. He had no plan, no idea where to go. Only one thought in his head: get to Meher. He turned a corner sharply, nearly slipping on the polished floors. Office workers looked up in confusion as he sprinted past. Behind him, he could hear the heavy footsteps of men chasing him. He turned another corner and spotted the elevator doors closing. Meher was inside. "Wait!" Rafiq shouted. Meher's eyes widened as she saw him. She reached out and hit the button to hold the doors open. Rafiq threw himself inside just as the men rounded the corner. The doors slid shut between them. For a moment, neither he nor Meher spoke. They were both breathing hard. Finally, Meher looked at him. "Did you get the files?" Rafiq hesitated. His heart was still racing. His mind was still reeling from what Hamid had said. Meher's expression didn't change, but there was something in her eyes. Something unreadable. Rafiq swallowed hard. He didn't know who to trust. But right now, he was trapped in an elevator with the one person who might have been lying to him from the very beginning. The elevator hummed as it descended, but the air inside was thick with tension. Rafiq clutched the USB drive in his pocket, his mind still spinning from what Hamid had said. He felt Meher's eyes on him, waiting for an answer. His heart pounded. If she really had been using him, then he had just handed her the only proof that could take someone down, maybe even the wrong person. Meher's voice was steady but firm. "Rafiq, did you get the files?" He swallowed hard. "Yes." A small exhale of relief escaped her lips. "Good. We're almost there." Rafiq hesitated. "Meher," he turned to face her, searching her expression. "Is Hamid telling the truth? Are you being framed?" Something flickered in her eyes, but it was gone as fast as it appeared. "Rafiq, Hamid is a liar. He's been manipulating people for years. That's how he gets away with things." "But what if you're wrong?" Rafiq asked, his voice tightening. "What if this isn't what you think?" She studied him for a moment, then took a slow step closer. "You have a choice to make," she said quietly. "You can believe Hamid and walk away. Or you can help me end this for good." Rafiq's pulse pounded. His entire life, he had been invisible, avoiding trouble, keeping his head down. But now, for the first time, he held something that mattered. And he didn't know what to do with it. Before he could answer, the elevator dinged. The doors slid open to the basement parking lot. Meher stepped out first, scanning the area. Rafiq hesitated before following her. The lot was eerily quiet, except for the distant hum of an engine idling. Then, out of the shadows, Hamid emerged. Rafiq froze. He wasn't alone. Two men stood behind him, their expressions unreadable. One of them had his hand tucked inside his coat. Meher stopped. Her jaw tightened. Hamid's eyes flickered with amusement. "You really thought it would be that easy?" Meher's shoulders squared. "It's over, Hamid. We have the proof." Hamid chuckled, shaking his head. "You still don't get it, do you?" He gestured around the empty lot. "Do you see any reporters here? Any police?" "Well, because the truth doesn't matter if no one ever sees it." Rafiq felt a chill creep up his spine. Hamid took a slow step forward, locking eyes with Meher. "Give me the USB." Meher stood her ground. "No." For the first time, Hamid's smirk faded. The man behind him shifted slightly. Rafiq caught the movement and realized something. The man wasn't just standing guard. He was waiting for a signal. This wasn't just intimidation. This was a threat. Rafiq's heart pounded. If Meher didn't hand over the USB, Hamid wasn't going to let them walk away. Rafiq's fingers tightened around the drive in his pocket. He couldn't just stand here. Then, in a flash, he made his choice. With one quick motion, he yanked the USB from his pocket and threw it as hard as he could. The small device arced through the air, landing with a clatter near a drain. For a split second everyone froze. "Nkit." Meher lunged toward the USB. Hamid's men moved at the same time. Rafiq grabbed the mop bucket beside him and shoved it into Hamid's path, buying Meher a second. She snatched the USB off the ground, but one of Hamid's men grabbed her wrist. Rafiq acted on instinct. He threw himself at the man, knocking him off balance. They stumbled, and Meher managed to wrench free. Hamid cursed under his breath. "Enough of this." The second man reached into his coat, but before he could pull anything out, a sudden burst of sound filled the air, screeching tires. A black car sped into the lot, headlights flashing. The doors flung open. "Security officers." Hamid's expression twisted. Meher's voice rang out. "They know everything, Hamid." The officers rushed forward. Hamid took one last glance at Meher, then turned sharply to his men. "We're leaving." Without another word they disappeared into the shadows. Rafiq let out a shaky breath. His hands were trembling. Meher turned to him, clutching the USB tightly. "That was reckless." Rafiq exhaled a weak laugh. "Yeah, but it worked." She stared at him for a long moment, then smiled slightly. The weight in Rafiq's chest finally lifted. For the first time in his life, he wasn't just a janitor. He had made a difference. The tension in the parking lot slowly faded as the security officers spread out, making sure Hamid and his men were truly gone. The echoes of hurried footsteps disappeared into the night, swallowed by the city's restless hum. Rafiq let out a long breath, his legs finally relaxing beneath him. His hands were still shaking, his mind still trying to process everything. He turned to Meher, who stood beside him, gripping the USB drive as if it held the weight of the world. Meher's face was unreadable for a moment, but then she glanced at him and gave a small nod. "You did the right thing," she said. Rafiq wasn't sure if it was true, but hearing her say it made something settle in his chest. For so long he had been stuck in the background, just a man who mopped floors while the world moved around him. But tonight he had changed something. The security officers approached Meher, one of them stepping forward. "Madam, we received your report earlier," he said. "Everything you sent over checks out. The higher-ups are already looking into it." Meher handed over the USB drive. "Make sure this gets to the right hands." The officer nodded. "We'll take it from here." Rafiq watched as the officers walked away, carrying the proof that would finally expose the corruption that had been hidden for so long. There was a strange mix of relief and uncertainty in his chest. It was over, but what now? Meher turned to him, a tired but grateful look in her eyes. "You should leave before anyone asks too many questions," she said gently. "This isn't your fight anymore." Rafiq hesitated. "But what happens now?" Meher exhaled, looking up at the dim lights of the parking lot. "There will be an investigation. People will be questioned. Some will try to cover their tracks, but the truth is out now. It's only a matter of time." Rafiq nodded slowly. He wasn't used to being part of something this big. The idea that he had played a role in it felt surreal. Meher looked at him again, her expression softening. "I never lied to you, Rafiq," she said. "I asked for your help because I knew you were someone I could trust. And I was right." For a moment he didn't know what to say. Then he gave a small smile. "I just hope I didn't make things worse." Meher let out a quiet chuckle. "You did the opposite." A moment of silence passed between them. Then Meher reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope. She held it out to him. Rafiq frowned. "What's this?" "Your payment," she said simply. "For helping me." He looked down at the envelope, feeling the weight of it in his hands. He could already tell it was more money than he had seen in a long time. For someone like him it could change everything. But something about it didn't sit right. Slowly, he handed it back to her. "I didn't do this for money." "Me." Meher looked at him for a long moment, something unreadable flickering across her face. Then she smiled, a real genuine smile. "I know," she said softly. She tucked the envelope back into her bag without another word, as if she had expected his answer all along. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. The night air was thick with unspoken thoughts, the distant hum of the city filling the silence between them. "You should go," Meher finally said, her voice gentle but firm. "You've done your part. It's time to step away." Rafiq hesitated. "And what about you?" She sighed, glancing toward the street where the officers had disappeared. "I'll be fine. There's still a lot to do, but at least now the truth is out." He nodded, unsure of what else to say. He wasn't used to being part of something like this, something bigger than himself. And yet, for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had mattered. Meher took a step back, giving him one last look. "Take care, Rafiq." "You too," he said. And with that, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the restless city. The streets stretched ahead of him, unfamiliar yet full of possibility. He had always been just a man in the background. But tonight he had changed something. And maybe, just maybe, he wasn't done yet.